Without any further ado, I'm sure you don't want to hear me talk. You'd much rather hear our returning ShmooCon presenter, who's will be talking for the second time at the final ShmooCon talk. So please give Yael a warm ShmooCon welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. This is probably my favorite conference I've ever presented at. Oh, my bad. Hi, everybody. Is this on? Oh. All right, here we go. Take two. Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to be here for the last Shmoo. This is probably my favorite conference I've presented on. I gave a talk on VPNs a couple years ago, and I'm super honored to have the opportunity. For those of you who don't know me, the most important thing to know about me for the purpose of this talk is that sometimes people get angry at me on the internet. Completely unrelated to that, I work at Consumer Reports. I'm a program manager working on cybersecurity research on the policy team, and I also do freelance investigative tech reporting. And then I maintain a data broker opt-out list called the Big Ass Data Broker Opt-out List, or if you want to not swear, you can call it Bad Bool. I think a lot of people I know who get into doxing prevention came into it from Gamergate, but for me it was actually from MMA writing. I learned that when you say things about fighters people like, that like when they do stupid things like driving on the sidewalk and you call it out publicly, people get really upset. And so I had a nice soft landing into learning about doxing because the person who tried to dox me was posting in the comments section of a site that I moderated. So it's a lot easier to delete the information and also find out who he was and where he worked and all of his email addresses and IP addresses. But of course, I'm like, oh my God, all my information is online. And so of course I Googled myself. I still get shocked at what I find about other people when I casually Google them. Name, address, past addresses, social media handles, relatives, a million handles that you thought were secret. I think I found a live journal I kept in high school that like 3 people read once that was somehow linked to everything, even though I used a fake username. And so I started really worrying about this because aside from MMA fans who get mad, I also did a bunch of freelancing and tended to anger all sorts of people. And then I did some activism work, and I was a woman online. I ask follow-up questions that make people angry sometimes. And of course, like, I just want to point out this is like not as bad for me as it is for some people. Obviously, there's entire communities that are targeted. I have a lot of friends who have had to leave their homes, and so yeah, it's a big issue, especially for marginalized communities, the queer community, people of color, etc. But I thought I was pretty good at scrubbing my address from people search sites, so it was kind of okay if people got mad at me because they probably wouldn't figure out where I lived. And then I started this data broker opt-out list because I was constantly going through these sites trying to figure out how do you remove your information. And they keep changing how you do it. These sites buy each other out, they go out of business, the links fail, and it's very annoying. And also people didn't know how to prioritize it. Like, where do you even get started? Because you can spend hours removing yourself from obscure sites and still be on these main ones. But unfortunately, what I learned is that this isn't if you're a voter or your own property, or your adversary is someone who has access to either a data broker you can't get your information off of, or like a trace skipping service, or even a sketchy private investigator, they can still figure out where you live pretty easily. And so I guess like what I do is sort of security by obscurity, because I'm like, oh, I'm hoping that people that want to find out where I live are not very tech savvy and will give up if they can't find it right away. But the really annoying thing about opting out of these sites is that it is like whack-a-mole, because it keeps cropping back up over and over again. And you have to also do annoying things like sending your ID, filling out weird CAPTCHAs. Sometimes they want you to have access to an address you no longer have access to confirm that it's you. So it's very annoying. And then so to speed things up, some people will use paid services that do a lot of the heavy lifting. And I was lucky enough to work with Top Poppy to analyze a bunch of them for Consumer Reports. So we recruited a bunch of volunteers. We looked up all of their information on 13 of what we thought were the most invasive people search sites. We signed them up for a data removal service. We had a control group that we opted out manually. And then it's like a time-consuming and frustrating process. But what we did was we checked on the information a week, a month, and 4 months later. And overall, the people search site removal industry, at least based on the data that we looked at, was not all that effective. We still found people's information. Like, you're paying money for these services to remove your information, and we still found them on a lot of the sites we paid to have them removed from weeks and even months later. I will say we had some limitations. We didn't actually log into every dashboard and get really involved in the process. We just kind of let it spin. And there were some services that did better than others. The two that did the best for us were Optory and Easy Opt-outs. And I personally use Easy Opt-outs because it's only $20 a year, which is pretty amazing, and performs almost as well as much more expensive services. But they don't, none of these services cover everything, and so I also created a separate sheet where you can see what the paid service you signed up for doesn't cover, because you still have to remove things manually. And I tried to prioritize this as well. But one of the most disturbing things that we found is not just that these services don't all work very well, and none of them work completely, is that there were these really disturbing misaligned incentives where you are paying somebody to remove your data from a people search site, and some of them have partnerships with those sites. And personally, I would not give money to, I don't think your motivation is in the right place if you're implicitly endorsing this inherently problematic people search ecosystem. This is my hiding spot. So funny story, I was at LabsCon, I gave somebody a challenge coin, and he wanted to send me one back and asked for my address. So I playfully challenged him to find it, and he was able to locate my information within 15 minutes, after a decade of me wiping myself out from all these sites. He also found many variations of a password I used before I knew any better. And he found a really spicy email address I used for 10 seconds over a decade ago. I'm really glad that you're my friend, because this could be easily weaponized. And the way that he did it was he found a paid version of a people search site that had an old address for me, which I left up there because I thought it would be good misdirection. But the paid version of it had my actual address. And I didn't know that because I didn't have a paid account. And the worst thing about this story is that he never actually sent me the coin. So in revenge, I sent him on a wild goose chase for a piece of information which doesn't exist, which I recommend doing. Ask somebody to find out where you went to high school if you were homeschooled, or to find your maiden or middle name when you don't have one. I think that's pretty good revenge. But the other thing about it is that it can be crowdsourced. So even if the people trying to find out where you live are not very good at it, a lot of them have friends that are. And people have found my address on some sketchy off-roading app that has a list of property owners in the city. I don't know why, but every time I find one of these, I add them to the list if there is a way to opt out, and if you can verify that they have your information before giving it to them. But it keeps coming back up. It really is whack-a-mole. And I'm not the only person who's bad at this. I know other people who do this for a living, and they just cannot stop their information from cropping back up over and over again. So if even experts in this industry cannot keep their data private, what recourse does that have for the rest of us? So the title of this talk was about graduating from opt-out whack-a-mole, and you're probably wondering, how am I qualified to talk about that, since I just said I was easily doxxed? The only reason I didn't get swatted is because I was doxxed by a friend. And so a lot of people will tell you, oh, you should buy an LLC, buy a home with an LLC that doesn't trace back to you. And I've actually talked to 3 people just this weekend who have tried to do that, and some of them did trace back to them, or there was historical records, or they couldn't do it because they would lose on property, some kind of tax thing. I don't know, it's different in each state. Or they just, when you bid on a house, they don't always want to wait for you to form your LLC. So I don't really have a foolproof solution for that, unless you want to, live in the woods and throw all of your devices into the sea, which I can't do. In fact, I found it really hard to stop looking at my phone while making these slides. So the secret to getting out of opt-out whack-a-mole is that we need a policy solution, because we cannot graduate from this game of perpetual whack-a-mole without doing that. You can minimize information, and it does have some effect, but the reality is that you cannot get all of this information taken down easily. One of the annoying things about the need for a policy solution is that it's something people have been asking for a really long time. So I wrote about this in 2018, and the FTC had a 110-page report on data brokers that it released in 2014. And they were like, there should be a centralized mechanism or portal to allow consumers to access their data and opt out in one click. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really great idea. But we still don't have a federal law governing data brokers. We do have some state laws, and the Delete Act of California is going to implement universal deletion next year. And that's really cool, because it has a provision saying if your information is not, like they have to check to make sure your information is still deleted every 45 days. But unfortunately, there's a loophole. There's a carve-out for what they call publicly available information. And actually, when we did our study, we found that I was thinking that people in California would have less data on them online, but that was not the case. So even if you live in a state with a privacy law, it doesn't actually protect you from this. Maryland is doing something really cool. They have a data minimization law that prohibits sharing information with data brokers by default. And that's cool because companies cannot collect information unless it's necessary to provide the service that you're paying for. And I love that, because the less information that's collected, the less likely they are to sell or share that information or have it be compromised due to an inevitable data breach. But there is still a carve-out for publicly available data. In fact, this carve-out exists in every single state that has a consumer privacy law: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Indiana, Iowa, Montana, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Virginia. So I have a belay here because I thought I was in the belay track until 2 days ago. So this is the belay portion of my talk. Because we are in DC, and so I'm going to recommend a policy solution. I think we need to make it easier for people to restrict availability of their data. And I think we need to make it harder for companies to share and sell that data. I think we need to create constraints on what data is made publicly available and how to access it. We might want to revisit what information is stored as public record, because it can get copied in bulk and used in ways that cause harm. But what about the First Amendment? People always say this when I bring this up, and it's a good point. There's good reasons to have public records for reporting. Aggregating and selling information linked to individuals, though, I don't think falls in that category. But I can't tell a company you shouldn't use public data when it's publicly available. But I do think we should be able to provide, add some friction to inspecting that data, so it's not available to everybody so easily. And there's actually precedence for this. There's a lot of times when I file public records requests and I'm required to go in person, or there's some kind of paper trail. You might have to physically retrieve a document from a physical filing cabinet or a local server. It would require filling out a form, providing ID. And a lot of states also have a process for removing yourself from these records if you're a public official, like a police officer or a judge, or if you have a notarized report identifying yourself as a victim of stalking or domestic violence. But I think we should do this before you become a victim of stalking or domestic violence. We should make this easier and more available for people who want to use it preemptively. And then the second belay part of my talk is the technical solution, because I've noticed that sometimes tech companies are incredibly good at removing information quickly. Like, they will ban you if you post the Vance dossier. So why can't they enforce their terms of service with that same level of fervor? And the fact that I spent literally years opting myself out and can still be easily doxxed by, I don't want to say anyone with an internet connection, because my friends do have skills in this, but they didn't have to use those skills. And there was no record, there was no paper trail of how the data was acquired. I think that contributes to the type of world that ShmooCon fights against, where intimidation and harassment run rampant. And I think we can do better. We can do better than telling people to live in a cave or throw all their devices into the sea. We can do better than security by obscurity, which is ultimately what my list is, but don't tell anyone. No, I don't think it should have to exist. We can do better than hoping that the people who come after us are not very good at this. So ideally, we wouldn't need any of these opt-out services or this list. They wouldn't need to exist because we'd have a single opt-out mechanism that includes your personal address and other information. And my policy silver lining is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because they have proposed rules to rein in the data broker industry. And if passed, it would classify data brokers as consumer reporting agencies under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and impose stricter regulations on how they collect and sell data. So customers would get access to it. It would limit the sharing of income and other sensitive data for illegitimate purposes. It would require consumer consent before information is sold. And I bet everybody in this room has thoughts on whether consent opt-ins work. So if you're a policy person or if you went to Hackers on the Hill, this is your moment to shine because there is a public comment period through March 3rd. And I really hope this passes. It won't solve all of the problems with people search sites, but I think it's an example of a really creative solution from an organization you wouldn't necessarily expect to be one of the first to crack down on these issues. I don't know if we have time for questions, but here is my contact information. I love talking about this. I'm on all the things, and thank you so much for listening. Let's see what time it is. I think we do have 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, oh, fantastic. I have one. This is a little bit of a leading question. I'm over here, Yael. So one of the things you talked about were data brokers, but there's also all of the genetics and ancestry websites scrape public records. What's been your experience in getting records removed from those, given that they're public records that they've consumed and that all of their paid customers can access and scan through? So all you would need to do is pay $30 a year for Ancestry, and now you've got all the public records.
Yeah, I think I heard most of that, so I'll try to answer. You can tell me if I missed anything. Public genetic databases, one of the things that's difficult with them is that if you've signed up and agreed to allow them to use your data, you can't scrape that back because they do actually try to anonymize it in a legitimate, like the scientific definition of anonymization. And then also, if you have family members that use these sites, they have your genetic data. And so, yeah, it's kind of a tough one. I know, like, I'm a 23andMe person. Like, I used it a really long time ago to write an article, and I asked them to remove my data. And it was such a pain in the butt. They made me, I wanted to download it before removing it, and they gave you each section of it separately in a million different ways. I also had a friend who didn't remember she gave them fake information on her birth date, and they wouldn't let her access it to be able to delete it because she didn't have what they thought her birth date was. And so, like, yeah, it's a problem. There's a lot of issues. It's really hard to kind of put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Just a little thought for you when you think about trying to register property and stay away from it. If you said putting in an LLC, but the problem is an LLC, you have to register who the members are with the state, and that information comes out. The answer is really to do a land trust. And what you do is you get an attorney to be the trustee. You're the grantor, and you're also the beneficiary. The land trust doesn't have an EIN. It doesn't have a place of business, but it does exist as a legal entity. And at least in the state of Florida, you can hold your homestead through a land trust, which is a tax question you're asking about, so that it will limit the rate of increase of your property taxes if you owned it in your own name. But your name appears absolutely nowhere except on a document that's in the safe of your lawyer's office.
Yeah, I don't, honestly, this is different for each state. I have people who tried to do a trust and they wouldn't have gotten the taxes in their state, so I can't really speak to Florida. I'm sure there's ways to do it. I just found a lot of people have trouble with it for various reasons. One of them is that it's not as anonymous as I thought they would. One of them is the property tax issue, and the third issue people have come up against is that when you are bidding on a house, people haven't done it far enough in advance. And sometimes you get outbid for houses, so it can slow down the process. So yeah, I'm not saying it is impossible, but there's issues that can come up. But I think it's really state by state, so that's a good point. So talk to a lawyer in your state.
Hey, Yael, I got a question. This is kind of a devil's advocate question. We all grew up with, well, at least I grew up with phone books that listed your address alongside your name. How come there wasn't a huge epidemic of doxing and assault and, murder then?
I remember when phone books, you could get your number unlisted, and it was really cool because you just had to talk to one person, which was amazing. Yeah, and also, I think it was more difficult. It wasn't available for everybody. You could try to use 555-1212 to get an address for a different person in a different state, but it wasn't a common thing. But yeah, that is a good point.
Thanks.
Sir.
I think we have a couple minutes. I'll also be outside if anybody has other questions.